today, Kevin, we're going to go over the signs and basically how they color the houses. So do you kind of just want to give a brief explanation?
Yeah, so each sign, there's 12 signs, there's 12 houses. Each house has its corresponding sign, and each sign has its corresponding house. So we'd start with Aries in the first house. Aries would be the first sign of the zodiac, corresponds to the first house. Taurus, second sign of the zodiac, corresponds to the second house. Gemini to the third house. Cancer to the fourth house. Leo to the fifth house. Virgo to the sixth house. Libra to the seventh house. Scorpio, eighth house. Sagittarius, ninth house. Capricorn, 10th house. Aquarius, 11th house. So the signs would be like an energetic filter. At least that's how I think of it. They're an archetype which then blends its energy with the sun, the moon, and the planet that happens to be in there, to where the house would be an area of life. That's how it's traditionally taught. I personally have found that they can go either way. So a sign could show up as an area of life, and a house could show up like the energetic filter of the sign which it corresponds to. So if something happened to be in the second house, it could have a Taurus-like quality. Or if something happened to be in Taurus, there may be an emphasis on money. There's more to the second house than Taurus and money, but that's one of the primary things that's typically described with it. So I'm using that as a brief description. So what I would invite everybody to do as we go about learning is to think of them as either or both. And to think of the houses as overlapping with the signs, and both the sign and the house being like an energetic filter, as well as describing areas of life which that planet or the sun and the moon's energy may be prominent, like in like an area of life. And that concept is also not explicitly said, but kind of implied in a number of astrology books that are in this cookbook format, where they'll talk about one planet, typically an outer planet, say like Saturn. There's a lot of books on Saturn. And they'll say Saturn in Aries or the first house, Saturn in Taurus or the second house, and then they'll give this description as if it's the same thing. So all these books are implying that it is the same thing. And perhaps it is, though it's typically not taught like that when the person's learning astrology. So with that said, let's get into each of the 12 signs and houses. So in Western astrology, these signs are also delineated by where the sun is at a particular moment in time. So the Aries begins at the moment of the spring equinox. Cancer begins at the moment of the summer solstice, or as the sun, so at the moment of the summer solstice, which would be when the sun gets to its longest, when the days are longest. It's based on astronomy, not astrology. So it has to do with where the sun is in relationship to the earth as it wobbles. So if you imagine the earth is spinning around its axis, going around the sun like this, the summer solstice would be when the axis of the earth is pointing towards the sun, and the winter or the northern axis, and the winter solstice would be when that southern axis of the earth is pointing towards the sun. And then the equinoxes would be the exact midpoint. So that's how we get the beginning of the 4 cardinal signs, is the 2 equinoxes and the 2 solstices. And then, as I understand it, once you have those 4 quadrants, they're divided evenly as far as then the beginning of the other signs.
Okay, so Aries is March 21st to April 19th. It's a cardinal fire sign ruled by Mars. I think the general description when people think of Aries is that it represents leadership and dynamic change. It's all about taking initiative to bring things in a new direction. Aries energy doesn't stay stuck in one place, it keeps moving. I mean, would you agree with that?
I absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's the nature of the energy of this archetype is it's action oriented, it's direct, it's prone towards anger and can be temperamental. It's very often very physically oriented, very self-oriented. So, you know, being a cardinal sign, one of the things I was thinking about, you know, cardinal signs are speaking, you know, typically talked about as signs that initiate. And I would say really like Aries would be the one of the cardinal signs that really fits that description. Maybe not for some of the other ones. So yeah, it's a fiery energy. It's fast, it's direct, it's physical. Very often athletes have a lot of Aries or Mars energy prominent in them. It has leadership qualities, though it doesn't necessarily make a great leader. It has the qualities of leader in that it anytime there's something that needs to get done, it just moves forward and it gets involved. It may not be great at managing people. But that piece of taking action and you know, leading the charge, so to speak, is very much an Aries kind of leadership type quality that's can be very positive. So something else to consider is every sign is positive and negative qualities.
So we'll talk about the first house. It's typically thought of, I guess, as the house of self-identity. It represents awareness. I've heard it also, people sometimes say it represents physical appearance and characteristics. It's also resourcefulness. And again, going back to that Aries energy, new beginnings, taking initiative.
Yeah. And something that's distinct to the first house is that when a planet shows up in the first house, it tends to be prominent in a person's chart, particularly if it's close, like the closer it is to the ascendant, it tends to just be prominent. And if it's on the first house side, it very often may even influence their appearance, or like it'll be more noticeable, perhaps. So yeah, first house, it's all about the self, the body, health issues sometimes, like particularly when an outer planet transits over the ascendant, very often that will correspond to when a person goes through a health crisis. So it does seem to also connect with the body.
Taurus is April 20th to May 20th. It's a fixed sign. It's a fixed earth sign ruled by Venus. Taurus represents everything that is dependable. A lot of people feel that it has a calm energy. I'm not sure if you'd agree with that. Taurus energy is known to be steadfast and slower moving. Taurus energy is also known to be trustworthy, and it'll see through to the end, almost the opposite of Aries, where Aries is like, we got to get it done this second. Taurus has more stamina. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, what I would also add to that, Taurus is known for being sensual. So it's a sign that values nice things and things of the senses. So that's something I've noticed, is that people with a lot of Taurus energy, they like to have nice stuff. They value nice stuff. They also value money. In general, money is important to people with a lot of Taurus energy. I would agree with the kind of slow moving, steady nature. Taurus likes to just stay in whatever it is. You know, it doesn't like change. Another thing with Taurus that shows up sometimes is an affinity to nature and the environment.
Okay. And the second house, I think typically people think of it as the house of value or money. It represents material and immaterial things of certain value. So I'm not sure if you would agree, but it doesn't necessarily have to be physical money. It's anything that you value in your life. possessions, acquisitions. I've heard a lot of astrologers also talk about inheritance being a second house matter.
Yeah, I've actually heard eighth house is more to do with like inheritance. So you could say second and eighth house, like that axis, as well as the Scorpio Taurus axis, having to do with money. I wouldn't be surprised if inheritance showed up in either the second or eighth house. Eighth house has to do with death as well. So people die and then there's inheritance. I feel like Taurus in the second house, there's more. That's one of those signs that I kind of have my eye on them. I feel like pop astrology has left some things out there. Money, inheritance, like stuff, I would say.
Okay. And so we'll move on to the sign of Gemini, which is May 21st to June 20th. It's a mutable air sign ruled by Mercury. Gemini is dynamic, exciting energy. It's all about communication and variety. It's very fast moving. And I think a really great description of Gemini is quick-witted. Like I think people that I've met that have strong Gemini in their chart have that energy. So I don't know if you will want to add anything to that.
Yeah. So Geminis are known for liking to know a little bit about a lot of things, liking to interact with a lot of people a little bit. It's a very kind of fleeting, type energy. So it would be kind of the opposite of Taurus in that it doesn't really, similar to Aries in that it doesn't really necessarily stay with anything for all that long.
And so the third house is ruled by Gemini, and it's the house of communication. It's also described as being associated with siblings and childhood relationships. I've always found the third house to be hard to describe, so I'm hoping you can give more insight into it.
Yeah. So what I found with the third house is, I would agree that issues with siblings shows up there. I find people with a lot of third house energy interact with a lot of people. They're usually in work, but it could be from anything. They find themselves in a position where they just interact with a lot of people like a little bit, So, I mean, especially in today's world, there's a lot of jobs that can fit that description. So very often people who have one of those types of jobs have third house. I've noticed a few people with third house moon or Gemini moon also have a lot of people over to their house. They kind of have those households where they host events or they have a lot of friends who kind of come over every once in a while type thing. So that's like I've heard like third house also described as like travel around the neighborhood, to where ninth house would be like travel abroad. And I would also add like your experience in school as a child will sometimes be described by what you see in the third house.
Okay, so moving on to Cancer. Cancer is June 21st to July 22nd. It's a cardinal water sign ruled by the moon. And I actually think Cancer is probably one of the signs that people understand the most, just in just general pop astrology. It's associated with home and family life. It embodies this feeling of compassion and things that are closest to us. I always think of Cancer as just kind of being a protective energy, perhaps. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
It's very often described as being emotionally sensitive and kind of protecting itself because it's so easily triggered. The idea of the crab kind of walking sideways. The other thing I was just thinking about the other day is the cardinal signs. There's a sense of responsibility in all four of the cardinal signs. So if you think about Aries as like responsibility to oneself, Cancer would be responsibility typically to family, though it can show up in other ways. That's the most common way that people with like prominent Cancer feel responsibility towards family, perhaps their close friends. There's a sense of like nostalgia that very often comes with Cancer. People have like fond memories of the past.
Okay. And Cancer rules the fourth house, which is known as the house of home. I mean, I think you could also say home and family, maybe. It's our foundation and environment. I think a lot of people think of the fourth house as being this mother energy, but I mean, it's a caretaker energy that kind of brings you comfort and security.
So traditional astrology would say issues with your mother will show up in the fourth house, to where issues with the father would show up in the 10th house. I would say issues with either parents can show up in the fourth house, much more likely than the 10th house. And then Liz Green, a famous astrologer, found it to be reversed. So that would be one of those cases where she found father issues to show up in the fourth house and mother issues to show up in the 10th house. So I would say just like your childhood, particularly your childhood at home, is going to be described by the fourth house. So people who have a lot of planets in the fourth house, or their sun or the moon, will be very much shaped and influenced by their childhood experience at home. If there's outer planets in the fourth house, very often there's trauma that will correspond to the nature of that planet from the parents, or something in the home. And then as adults, it could also describe what your home is like as an adult with your family.
Okay. So we'll go to Leo, which is July 23rd to August 22nd. It's a fixed sign, fixed fire sign ruled by the sun. Leo typically represents courage, standing strong in the face of adversity. The energy is regal and bold. And I think typically what people think of is Leos very much value honesty and loyalty. So I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Leos want to shine their light. They want to do their thing. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be felt and acknowledged. Though not, that's not always the case. That's another common description with the sign of Leo.
So the fifth house is ruled by Leo, and I find the fifth house also to be another similar to the third house. I've always found it harder to describe. It's associated with love and creativity. It's typically thought of as what brings us enjoyment and a feeling of abundance and pride. I've heard it associated with romance as well as pets and children. It's very much children, I know, are associated with the fifth house, but I'm hoping you can kind of.
Yeah, I've heard pets go in the sixth house, though I can't say for sure. That's kind of a random thing. Maybe it depends on the type of relationship you have with your pet. Certainly children. Very often, if you have a planet in the fifth house, it will in some way describe your child, if you have a child, as well as romance and self-expression. So it's kind of this interesting mix of things that seem very different. But if you think about like the energy of the child is naturally self-expressive and creative and playful. And I think ultimately like good romance is kind of playful and light and joyful and fun. So so I would say that I find it very interesting that planets in the fifth house very often will describe your kids, and people who have prominent Leo or fifth house very often have something to do with kids in their life is prominent, whether it's working with kids or just really liking kids. Some people just really, their heart is warmed by being around kids.
Okay, so let's move on to Virgo, which is August 23rd to September 22nd. And it's a mutable earth sign ruled by Mercury. Virgo represents order and discipline. I've heard it also described as being practical and careful. It's very much, I think the main thing that people think of with Virgos is being very detail oriented and striving for perfection. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that.
The Virgo it's like the craftsman, so they have that attention to detail. I would say that describes it well.
Okay, and the sixth house is it's I think it's typically described as the house of work, but it's also I've heard it described associated with health. It's what brings us kind of strength and vitality. It's associated with employment, as well as services performed for others. I think the sixth house is another house that has kind of conflicting energies, perhaps.
Yeah. So I sixth house is something I specialize in. My sun, moon, total 5 planets in the sixth house. Um, I would say the sixth house is about work, but as it regards to like your day-to-day work. So it's not necessarily work that's exclusive to your career as it is work anywhere. So it could be work around the home. It could be work that involves service to others. So maybe if you're people like with a lot of sixth house energy are inclined to help others in one way or another, so that then they find themselves doing work for other people. My belief is that health is a prominent topic in the sixth house because how we live our life day to day very much has a huge impact on our state of health. And so health, like when there's a transit going through the sixth house and a person has planets there, or perhaps something in the 12th house that's getting an opposition from a transiting sixth house planet, then a health issue may show up because if you're living kind of like a standard American life where you're eating junk food, you're not exercising, you're not sleeping enough, then a health issue may show up as a result of that. So I would say, the other side would be people who have a lot of prominent sixth house, which I would say describe to me are people who are very focused on health. So people who are more inclined to exercise and watch what they eat and to just think about how they're living their life and how it's affecting their health. But I think the other thing to say about the sixth house that's important is daily routines.
Okay.
So like my like daily routines are very important to me. I like to wake up and I have what I like clean the kitchen, I have my coffee, and then I like to go meditate. And so like that's something that will also be described by planets in the sixth house.
And that describes the energy of Virgo as well. Just being
Very much
detail
so.
oriented and that kind of more regimented and trying to strive.
I think Virgos are kind of seen as people who are like overly tidy, or kind of nitpicky about whatever the details may be. And there's this focus on like the day-to-day, moment-to-moment living and how that's impacting whatever it is that's important to that individual.
Okay, so Libra is September 23rd to October 22nd. It's a cardinal air sign ruled by Venus. Libra represents balance and diplomacy. It's thought of as being fair and striving for balance on both sides to reach a compromise. And I think that Libra energy is balanced, then it will be a more calm energy. And if it's unbalanced, then it's going to be kind of a more high energy feeling. I mean, would you agree with that?
But what I find with Libras, and I have a lot of Libra in my family, there's a sense of justice, or like a concept of what is right that is also part of that Libra archetype. And so the person with a lot of Libra energy may really have a like a strong opinion about what's right and wrong. And when that is violated, they're very often going to be outraged. And so when that happens, the Libra individual has a dilemma because Libras don't like conflict. Part of that Libra energy is to keep the peace. So they're very often inclined to placate others. And so what you'll see from Libra, especially if somebody has Mars in Libra, is they won't say anything and then they'll explode. And eventually they'll have a meltdown. Or their health will be affected because they've kind of, repressed their anger. So, but yeah, in general, the Libra energy is adverse to disrupting the peace. Another thing that's important to say about Libra being a cardinal sign, there's a sense of responsibility in relationships. So there's also a focus on relationships in general with Libras. Libras tend to value their friendships And they like to hang out with their friends. They want to go interact. They want to go socialize. It's also kind of got this sense of like refinement. So Libras tend to be artistic in some way, or have a sense of like what's beautiful. So they like to have things that are aesthetically pleasing.
Okay, and we're going to move on to the seventh house, which is, I think this is actually one of the easier houses to understand.
Probably the easiest of all the houses.
Yeah, it's the house of relationships. And when we say relationships, that can be, it's really partnerships. It could be romantic partnerships, it could be a spouse, but it could also be a business partner. And I think going back to that Libra energy, it's about finding equilibrium and diplomacy within relationships. Would you agree with that kind of general?
What I would say is any planets in the seventh house like will represent the types of people that show up in your life. So it can be romantic. It usually does. If you have a planet in the seventh house, particularly if it's an outer planet, your romantic partners probably will very much have that quality of energy. But it can really be anybody. And especially when there's a transit through your seventh house from one of the outer planets, you'll find that you are attracting people who fit the description of that planet more often than normal for the duration of that transit.
Okay. And so moving on to Scorpio, which is October 23rd to November 21st. It's a fixed water sign ruled by both Mars and Pluto. I think typically Scorpio represents, and I think Scorpio is one of these signs that we've talked about, that in pop astrology gets a bad rap. But it's really about transformation and regeneration. Scorpio energy takes everything that is hidden and transforms it to heal wounds. I think that maybe that description is too specific, but I'm hoping you can kind of expand on it.
Yeah, I mean, I will say it's one of the more polarized of in the way it gets expressed. So people with Scorpio energy have an affinity to the dark side. And so that can show up as just being a dark individual who's, engaged in whatever unpleasant activities, or somebody who's able to be present and witness darkness. So in my opinion, the best therapists, healers, and detectives would have a prominent Scorpio energy. It gives you the ability to seek the truth. And that's very often the case with Scorpio energy is it wants the truth at any cost. It also wants depth and authenticity. So typically people with a lot of Scorpio energy are very adverse to superficial interactions, small talks, to where the Libra energy loves that stuff. I would say, as well as like any of the air signs, they're very much fine with any sort of interaction, and the Libra energy would be adverse to that really deep, truly honest type relationship that involves those really like intense bonds. So Scorpio energy can also, like within a relationship, can be quite intense, so they want it all, right? They want like a deep, profound connection. They want pure truth and authenticity, and they want your full attention.
It's definitely a more intense energy. And I think that's why it's gotten that kind of negative feeling with pop astrology. Okay, so moving on to the eighth house. The eighth house, I think the eighth house typically is thought of as the house of death, but it's really more about transformation, the cycles of death and rebirth. And like we talked about with the second house, it can be associated with inheritance, resources. I think the eighth house is also a difficult house to describe. So I'm hoping you can kind of give a better
I would agree that it is. I would say intense emotional experiences show up in the eighth house. So planets that are in the eighth house will have a certain quality of intensity to them and will stimulate intense emotional experiences. And in my opinion, those intense emotional experiences are what lead to transformation, to the extent that you're willing to experience them consciously and to fully experience them. will be the extent to which you're able to be reborn. And that's a process. So if you have planets in your eighth house, there's a good chance that you will be more prone towards really intense emotional experiences that perhaps will move you towards like more profound spiritual growth. Interestingly, in the eighth house as well, Scorpio, you also see inheritances. I've noticed people who work in finance tend to have Scorpio or eighth house prominent.
Okay. So moving on to Sagittarius, which is November 22nd to December 21st. Sagittarius is a mutable fire sign ruled by Jupiter. It represents adventure and a willingness to embrace opportunity and embark on a journey with no destination. I think really that when I think of Sagittarius, it's freedom and boundless energy. So I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, Sagittarius archetype is fun loving. It likes to socialize, it's charismatic, lively, it likes to travel, likes to learn. It has an affinity towards philosophy, religion, anything that's kind of that kind of that philosophical, spiritual, religious. Could be more like certain sciences, maybe more of the like social, a lot of enthusiasm about their beliefs. So the Sagittarius archetype can then also be somewhat preachy about their beliefs. They might, what to them might be a good debate, to somebody else might just be like being like kind of starting a fight.
The ninth house, I think, is typically thought of as the house of purpose. It's philosophical interests and experiences through exploration. I think people typically think of it as being very much, where the fourth house is home, and the ninth house, it would be how you're seen more in the public. It's also associated with ethics, education, knowledge within a belief system. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, so higher learning and travel are, as far as I understand, like the kind of like the main topics of the ninth house. So people who have a lot of ninth house energy very often like to travel like abroad, or outside of where they live, or are very focused on learning like bigger concepts.
Okay, and so we'll move on to Capricorn, which is December 22nd to January 19th. It's a cardinal earth sign ruled by Saturn. It represents structure and discipline in the face of adversity. Capricorn energy is traditional, cautious, and dignified. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, Capricorn, there's a sense of ambition, a sense of responsibility and duty. So towards whatever it may, that they may be feel like are their responsibilities, though very often it's oriented towards one's career or work, whatever it is that they're pursuing. So it's a slow moving energy as well. Things tend to unfold over the course of one's life when Capricorn is prominent. They tend to be more late bloomers. So they're inclined to be successful because they just kind of keep moving forward and keep working on whatever it is that they're focused on.
Okay, and Capricorn represents the 10th house, which is, I think, typically thought of as the house of enterprise, ambition, and career achievements. I think it's also typically thought of as community structures, which, I think people think of government. I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, career is typically the main topic for the 10th house. So the 10th house begins at the midheaven. And you could think of everything starting at the 10th, 11th, then 10th, then 11th, and 12th house. It's like where you move out into the public.
Aquarius is January 20th to February 18th. It's a fixed air sign ruled by Saturn and Uranus. Aquarius represents original ideas and higher mind thinking. Aquarius energy is independent and forward moving.
The Aquarius energy has its own way of doing things. So typically they're free thinking. They are oriented towards looking at like group dynamics. So they tend to be social, like be inclined towards social groups, which is the 11th, what the 11th house is typically described by. So, but yeah, that it's got this very often eccentric way of doing things, kind of an outside the box way of looking at life. And it can be a bit of an erratic kind of, I would say all three of the air signs don't like any sort of emotional exchanges. So, being that they're inclined to be mental, it's like emotions don't make sense. And so they kind of tend to be adverse to that.
Yeah, I think when I just from people that I know that have strong Aquarius in their chart, I always think of it as just being a very cerebral energy. So the 11th house, again, another house that I'm hoping you can describe better than the general pop astrology. But I think it's thought of as maybe the house of blessings, benefits through connectedness and networking. Also friends or people that have like-minded attitudes to you. Would be represented by the 11th house. But I'm hoping you can expand on that more.
I mean, typically community and social groups are the main topic, as is commonly described for the 11th house. Perhaps people with a lot of 11th house or Aquarius energy may feel like there's a sense of a higher purpose. They may kind of have a mission to improve the world in some sort of way. So there's also like a bit of a humanitarian spirit that could be part of the 11th house or Aquarius.
Okay, and finally, last but not least is Pisces, which is February 19th to March 20th. It's a mutable water sign ruled by Jupiter and Neptune. Pisces represents the push and pull between the reality of the world we live in and what we are striving for spiritually. Pisces energy is creative.
Yeah, so it's the energy of the dreamer, the artist, the musician, the mystic. The Pisces energy is very gentle. It's soft, it's dreamy, it's kind. Its dark side would also then be like passive aggressiveness, issues with being checked out from reality, perhaps. Excessive TV watching, drug and alcohol use, things like that.
Okay, so the 12th house, I think the 12th house is also difficult to describe, but it's thought of as really the house of maybe sacrifice.
It's nebulous, I will say. The 12th house, another issue that shows up in 12th house is spirituality, as well as large institutions such as government, the education system, the medical system, things like that. Also, a lot of prominent 12th house issues will indicate something that's kind of buried deep in the unconscious mind and is dysfunctional. So people with mental illness very often will have a prominent 12th house, or people who are very spiritually oriented towards life, or people who are involved in government, media, education, like on a, not like working as a teacher, but like, like at the more like government type level. And it very often will indicate something that, because it's like so buried in the unconscious, is become very dysfunctional, and it's like the person can't see it.